Ranking Chinese and U.S. officials hold high-level talks in Alaska starting Thursday. The meeting is key to setting the tone for bilateral relations. On the eve of the talk, Chinese Ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, met the press.
This high-level dialogue between the two sides in Anchorage is indeed the first face-to-face dialogue and communication between officials of this level since the Biden administration took office. I think both sides attach great importance to it. We have done a lot in preparation in the past few days. Of course, we don't expect to solve all problems in one dialogue, so we don't have anything unrealistic. We hope this can be a beginning, and the two sides will start a process of honest, constructive, and rational dialogue and communication. If this can be achieved, the dialogue will already be successful. In short, I hope that both parties will come with sincerity and live with a better understanding of each other.
Among all aspects of China-U.S. relations, trade and economic ties have always been crucial. This year, trade between China and the U.S. was off to a good start, with volume rising nearly 70% in the first 2 months. The U.S. is now China's third trading partner behind ASEAN and the EU. With China leading in economic recovery and the U.S. administration coming into the office, are American businesses in China more upbeat about the latest? On that, I spoke to Greg Gilligan, the chairman of American Chamber of Commerce in China. Let's hear what he has to say. In Beijing, Greg Gilligan, chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. Greg, what a pleasure to see you.
Good morning.
As one representing your member with AmCham in China, what are your expectations for the upcoming Alaska meeting between the two sides?
Well, I hope that it is the start of the return to a more normal sense of diplomacy between the U.S. and China. I don't think we can expect too much because it is just one meeting. But if we think back to the last meeting with the previous Secretary of State, that meeting didn't end too well. So I think it's likely that this will be much better and will perhaps set the framework for future engagement.
But in the overall China-U.S. relationship, how big is this role that economic and trade ties is going to play, which is where your turf is? We see that this administration coming into power pretty much trying to portray human rights as the core issue, alliance as the core issue. We also see the earlier administration trying to portray the trade deficit and the shall we say, not necessarily well-resulted policy as the priority. So from the business community's perspective, how do you see the role of business and economic ties in this regard?
First of all, the overarching concern for all of our members is U.S.-China relations. So it is top of mind for every business decision maker, and it is highly impactful to the way that businesses perform, especially because, as necessary to be forward-looking, they want to project what the future environment will look like so that they can have confidence in investment decisions. Having said that, I think that the Biden administration and their particular focus on any number of things, including human rights and others, is probably as to be expected, because it was really the Trump administration's lack of emphasis in some of those areas that was out of the ordinary, where if you look at many decades, the last 50 or 70 years of U.S. diplomacy, that was always part of it. And so I think, again, we're looking at what should be a return to normal diplomatic relations between the two sides, not where they necessarily will easily agree, but where they have a lot of experience in working with each other in these types of discussions.
I did notice the phrase you use, Greg, return to normal. Well, that phrase has been brought out and questioned whether there could be quote-unquote return to normal, and what is the normal or new normal, how to term it, what's the nature. Well, a whole set of questions. I'm afraid I have to throw all of them to you right now.
Return to normalcy means that the two sides actually speak to each other, which frankly in the last 2 years has not been the case, with the exception of the trade negotiators, which involved Vice Premier Liu He and his team, and on the U.S. side was Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer. But outside of those two groups, there was very little discussion between other parts of government on both the U.S. and China side.
Right.
That's not normal. What we hope for, and what frankly both sides need, is for government to be speaking to each other. And that would mean all the various departments and ministries that ordinarily would seek cooperation or collaboration or resolution of issues and problems. So this return to normalcy involves, first of all, speaking and diplomacy, and then it seeks to define what are the areas that allow cooperation, allow competition, and try to minimize confrontation and or conflict.
So in that regard, since you explained normalcy in your way, where is the trade and economic ties? Earlier, we see that plays a pivotal role in terms of characterizing China-U.S. relations, and that has been the foundation of a healthy development of these relations. Over the past decade, we see, though, that has been somewhat shaken. Now, as we mentioned, with the administration apparently emphasizing on human rights, will trade and economic ties still be the priority? To what extent, and how much persuasive power, lobbying power, does the business community, including member of yours, still have in Washington?
Well, I think that we will continue to play an important role. We believe that trade and economic ties between the U.S. and China are, in fact, the foundation of the relationship. The relationship, of course, is broader than just business, but every relationship needs a fundamental ballast, let's say. And so we believe that we are the ballast in that relationship so that the two sides can work with each other on other important issues. We do, however, need to navigate carefully because both sides are challenging each other in areas such as national security and law enforcement measures. And so we do our best to remain compliant with all of the necessary rules and regulations that those things involve. And then we seek to broaden the area for business to continue to operate. So what we do in times like these is we try to advocate for clarity in regulations so that we know how to be compliant with government's expectations of business. And we do other things. For instance, in the COVID-19 situation, we did our best to be part of the solutions necessary, whether it was in the scientific research and development of vaccines or in the manufacture and transport of personal protective equipment. All of those various things require that government and business work together.
What about the first phase and earlier potential second phase of the trade agreement between China and the U.S. of the earlier administration? Are they still relevant at this point, do you think?
Absolutely relevant, because it is a measure of how well the U.S. and China can identify, address, and solve the problems that the two sides speak to in the economic relationship. So phase one was a good start. It identified some goals. It achieved improvements in certain areas, but it was also a 2-year goal that includes 2021. So hopefully we'll make some progress back.
Greg, there has been complaints, at least from this part of the world, about the lack of action, walking back the earlier mistakes, as this part of the world thinks, about the Trump administration regarding China-U.S. relations by this current administration. How do you see this lack of action so far?
I think it's early, first of all. President Biden took office on January 20. So we're not that far. It's not even 2 months, so less than 60 days of the current administration. I think they seem to be quite active, quite busy, and moving forward. But the idea of being practical is to say that the U.S. has an enormous challenge right now that, quite frankly, doesn't necessarily involve foreign policy at the top of their list. So first of all would be controlling the virus, COVID-19, battling the epidemic in the U.S. Number two is certainly to revive the economy because of the economic impact of COVID-19. Number three is to address some of the societal divisions that involve racism and bias in the United States society that we're all trying to move forward and make progress on. And four is environmental protection, which is very high on the list of priorities for the Biden administration. And then there's sort of everything else. Now, the U.S.-China relationship is extraordinarily important to the entire world, and the Biden administration knows that. But I think a little bit of so-called go slow at this moment is appropriate because the challenges are so acute and frankly severe that they require very deliberate measures to get to a better place.
Next question is about technology. That has always been one single issue on everybody's mind, but at the same time increasingly impact China-U.S. trade relations because the American business operating in China are increasingly more embracing technology-oriented kind of business. And that's where the Chinese consumers are also looking at, their consumption power in the near future. So how do you see this issue being worked out ASAP? Is it possible? In what direction?
Well, both sides are competing for the heights of the future economy. And much of that involves technology and research and development intensive businesses. But what we try to focus on is that collaboration, cooperation can still occur, and competition is not a bad word. So we can compete with each other in certain areas, collaborate with each other in other areas, but what we don't want is confrontation or conflict. So again, returning to the ideas of national security and law enforcement, those things are appropriate and necessary for business to work very hard at compliance, and we do. So what we'll do is we'll push for clarity in those areas so that we can maximize the areas for competition and collaboration. When it comes to things like technology, because technology moves so fast, there's a lot of opportunity for us to collaborate, but sometimes it takes a lot of hard work to sit down and figure out how do we develop something together? Because if it doesn't exist yet, then there's, you don't have to fight over it. You can actually anticipate, well, this is where, technology is moving. And so how can we do something to create it and then own it together and bring it to global markets?
But there's one thing related to technology that we have seen some new developments. Semiconductor, for example, there has been a working group being organized between China and the United States regarding semiconductor from professional associations. They are selecting 10 members into this discussion and working group for the policies and for advice to the policies. How do you see this development? Is this going to be the trend?
Absolutely. And in fact, the statement I made just seconds ago came from a discussion I had with a member in the semiconductor industry. And so that member was saying, look, Greg, we can find ways to identify future development and areas that we can cooperate in.
Do you think that atmosphere, that ambience, that way of practice will be able to spread to the other areas of the so-called important technology sectors?
There's no reason it can't, except tension in the relationship, maybe a lack of understanding of the issues. We have to remember, and this is in fairness that I state, government regulators don't always know the business in the level of detail that drives the results they see.
Very true.
Sometimes, if they don't understand those business issues very specifically, they can get unintended consequences from policy. So it's imperative that business work closely with government to help refine what those policies seek to do in a way that allows for collaboration and competition.
Finally, the question is the upcoming Alaska meeting. If you were being asked by both sides with a telephone call tonight, what would you like to see in the meeting? And they want to hear your opinion. What would you say?
I would like to see both sides treating each other with respect and the appropriate gravity that's necessary, because China and the U.S. will remain great powers for a very long time into the future. The U.S.-China relationship is important to the entire world. So I would hope that the statements that come out of the meeting are measured and fair to both sides. And hopefully we will get an accurate description of what occurs in a way that supports each other's statements. So, you don't want one to come out of the meeting saying one thing and the other saying something entirely different. If we can see some consistency across the messages, I think that will be a good indicator that the meeting had a positive effect, and that future meetings will also continue to provide reasons for optimism.
Wonderfully said. Greg Gilligan, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir, as always.